In the last couple of sections, we finished up our deployment configuration file and the new cluster IP service to go along with it. We're now going to continue by putting together two more almost identical configuration files, this time all centered around our Express API, or the multi-server image. Now we're going to make sure that we do a very similar cluster IP service this time around, because we do not want the Express API to be directly accessible from the outside world, as would normally be the case with a node port service. Remember, we use the cluster IP anytime that we want to make a set of pods only accessible to other things inside of our node. The ingress service that we're going to eventually put together qualifies as another thing inside of our node. All right, so one quick thing I want to remind you about here is that our multi-server image is always going to be listening for incoming requests on port 5000. And that was something that we had really hard-coded into the image itself and the actual server that's running inside there. So when we create our cluster IP service, we're going to make sure that it's going to forward traffic onto port 5000 on each of those different pods. And again, just to keep each port the same on both sides, we're going to say that you can access the cluster IP by accessing 5000 as well. Just as I said previously, there's really not a great reason at first glance to, for some reason, change the port that the cluster IP accepts traffic on. So we're going to make sure that it's 5000 in both cases. All right, so let's get to it. I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. Inside of my K8s directory, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call this server-deployment.yaml. And then inside of here, we're going to put together some configuration that's going to look very, very similar to what we did in our client deployment just a moment ago. So we're again going to say API version, apps v1. We're going to have a type of deployment. For our metadata, we will provide a name of server deployment. And then we'll start to add on the spec that's going to customize exactly how this deployment behaves. So for my replicas, let's make sure we got the spelling correct. Again, this is the number of different pods that we're going to set up. We're just going to arbitrarily say that we want 3 pods running the multi-server image. We don't really know a whole lot about how to most appropriately scale these sets of pods yet, so maybe 3 is a good place to start. Maybe it's not. I don't know. We'll find it out when we actually deploy this thing and start to test our cluster with a little bit of traffic. Next up, we're going to specify the selector that the deployment is going to use to find the set of pods that it's supposed to control. So we're going to say that we want to match a set of labels, and then again, we'll do a component, but this time, rather than doing web as the value for the component key, I'll do server, like so. And so this is very clearly indicating that the component inside of our application that we are working on right here is the server. I want to remind you that the labels we put together can be anything you can possibly imagine. So we could just as easily do something like part of app API or something like that. But I personally enjoy this kind of component and then piece of the application terminology. I think that it's rather clear what this key value pair is indicating. Okay, so now that we got that put together, we're going to go back out in indentation to be on the same indentation layer as the selector and replicas, and then we will put together our pod template. So we'll first begin with our metadata that's going to specify our set of labels. And again, the labels that we apply to this thing must at least match up with whatever we put inside of the spec for the deployment itself. So for labels, I'll say component server, like so. All right, I'm going to indent back out a little bit more. So now I am on the same indentation level as metadata, and we're going to provide the spec that's going to customize the exact behavior of each of the pods that gets created. Now we're going to again provide a list of containers that this pod is supposed to run. Just as before, we are only going to have one single container inside of this pod. We don't have any other containers that need to run along with the multi-server image. So I'll give a name of server. The image is going to be my Docker ID / multi-server. And then the last thing that we're going to do for right now is to add on the list of ports that we want to make available. So for ports, I'm going to say that we want to have a container port accessible of 5000, like so. All right, now I want to give you a quick reminder The multi-server image that we put together does expect to get a handful of key value pairs along with it, or environment variables, that tells the multi-server or the Express API exactly how to connect to our Postgres instance and the Redis instance as well. So everything that we've put together inside this file at this point in time is definitely stuff we have to add in here, but we are going to eventually come back and add on a series of environment variables that we want to make sure get injected into the container that is created with this image. And remember, the entire goal of that is that we're going to tell the Express API how to connect to Postgres and Redis. All right, so we are going to come back to this file, but for right now, I want to just focus on finishing up this very specific piece of our application setup for right now. And I don't want to think just yet about how we're going to involve Redis and Postgres in here just yet. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to put together our configuration file for the cluster IP service. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute.